In the autumn of 2007, every farmer in Lac-Saint-Jean County did the same thing when the provincial soil report came back recommending higher phosphorus inputs. They drove to the co-op in Alma. They ordered the fertilizer blend the agronomist had specified. They applied it according to the rate card, and they did it without a second thought. Because that is what you did in Lac-Saint-Jean when the Provincial Extension Service told you something. You did not argue with the report. You did not call a different agronomist. You did not go home and pull out a different set of numbers and start running comparisons at the kitchen table at 11 o'clock at night. Nobody questioned the phosphorus recommendation the way nobody questions the frost date. You did it because the co-op sold it, and the extension agent endorsed it, and the neighboring farms were doing it, and the provincial government had printed it on a laminated card and posted it in the co-op office above the coffee maker where everyone could see it. Let me tell you about what blueberry country looked like in Lac-Saint-Jean in 2007, because you need to understand the land before you can understand what one 52-year-old woman did to it. The region runs flat from the Saguenay River south through rocky acidic soil that is almost worthless for most crops and almost perfectly suited for one, wild blueberries. Not the cultivated kind from British Columbia that you find stacked in plastic clamshells at Provigo, the low-bush kind, small and dark and intensely flavored. The kind that have been growing in that soil since before there were farms to tend them. The operations were medium-sized by Quebec standards. 100 acres, 200, some of them pushing 300. And they were almost uniformly managed the same way. Burn on a 2-year cycle, apply the provincial input recommendations, and deliver to the processors in Dolbo Mistassini at whatever price the cooperative was offering that week. The co-op fieldman was the center of agricultural advice the way the church was once the center of everything else. And his laminated input card was, for practical purposes, the agronomic policy of the region. The Tremblay operation sat 11 kilometers east of Alma on a paved road that turned to gravel past the second sugar bush. Gisèle Tremblay had managed it for 22 years, taking it over from her mother in 1985 at the age of 30, with 180 acres of blueberry barrens and a reputation for being difficult, which she had earned honestly by asking too many questions at the wrong moments in the wrong rooms. She was methodical in the way that people are methodical when they have learned that carelessness costs you things you cannot get back. She burned on schedule. She scouted for fruit fly. She attended the annual grower meetings in Alma and sat in the back row and wrote things down in a green spiral notebook she kept in the breast pocket of her field coat. She did not raise her hand often, but when she did, the room tended to go quiet in a way that suggested it would rather she hadn't. Her son-in-law was not a farmer. His name was Denny Archambault, and he worked in municipal planning in Roberval, and he had married her daughter Sophie 4 years earlier, and he came to Sunday dinners at the farmhouse with the confidence of a man who reads widely and has never yet been proven wrong about anything important. He was not unkind. He was the kind of man who listens to what you're saying and then explains to you what you actually meant. He had an opinion about the phosphorus inputs. He had an opinion about the burn cycle. He had an opinion about the provincial support programs and the processor pricing structure and the general direction of Quebec agriculture, and he shared these opinions at the kitchen table with the authority of a man who has read the right articles. Gisèle listened to him the way you listen to weather on the radio when you already know what it's doing outside. Let me tell you about what she had been noticing, because that is the real beginning of this story. For 3 years, Gisèle had been watching her yields decline in a specific pattern, not uniformly across the fields, not the random variation you expected from year to year, the weather variables, the late frost, the dry July. The decline was spatial. It followed something. It tracked along the low corridors between the field blocks where water moved after heavy rain, and it concentrated in the sections closest to the property line shared with the Boulanger operation to the north, which had been under new management since 2004 and had doubled its phosphorus application rate in the first season under the new owner. She had not said anything about this publicly because she had nothing yet except a pattern in her own data and a feeling she had carried in her body since she was a girl walking these fields with her mother, the feeling that the soil was telling you something if you were willing to read it slowly enough. She had also, in the autumn of 2006, sent soil samples from 14 different locations across her property to a laboratory at Université Laval, not the standard agronomic package the co-op sold. A full microbiological profile, fungi, bacteria, nematode populations, mycorrhizal colonization rates. The kind of analysis that cost 4 times what the standard test cost and took 8 weeks instead of 2 and produced a report that ran to 23 pages and required a dictionary. She had read all 23 pages, twice, and she had understood enough of it to know that what it was telling her was serious, and that she was going to have difficulty explaining it to anyone who had not read the same things she had read over the past 3 winters. The report showed mycorrhizal colonization rates in her high phosphorus sections that were running at roughly 30% of what the literature suggested was optimal for low-bush blueberry production. The fungi that blueberry roots depend on to access micronutrients were being suppressed by excess phosphorus. The soil was chemically adequate by every standard metric. It was biologically struggling in a way that no standard test would have detected. She had a 23-page document that said so, and she had a green notebook full of her own yield records that confirmed it, and she had 16 years of walking these fields and understanding the difference between soil that was working and soil that was being kept alive by inputs. She decided to reduce her phosphorus application on the south blocks by 60% and replace it with a mycorrhizal inoculant program she had read about in a paper out of Maine, and she decided to trial a compost amendment on 20 acres that the co-op had been recommending against for 4 years on the grounds that it was expensive and the results were inconsistent. She had done the math herself, in her own notebook, with her own numbers. This is when Dennis Archambault heard about it. He heard about it at Sunday dinner in March of 2008, when Gisèle mentioned, not as an announcement but as a fact already decided, that she was changing the input program on the south blocks. Sophie looked up from her plate. Denny set down his fork. He did it quietly, which was how you knew he was going to say something considered. He said that he had spoken to the co-op fieldman at the Alma Rona last week in an unrelated context, and that the fieldman had mentioned that the provincial input recommendations had just been updated upward, not downward. He said this the way you introduce a piece of information you expect to be decisive. He also said that he had read an article in Lac-Saint-Jean about Quebec blueberry operations that had tried unconventional input programs and struggled, and that in his view, in a year when the processor prices were uncertain, it was not the moment to be running experiments. Gisèle looked at him. She said, "I have 23 pages from Laval that say the inputs are the problem." One study. She said, 14 soil samples from my own fields. He said, "Gisèle, I'm not saying you're wrong. I'm saying this is not the year." It is never the year. That is the thing about caution when it has been dressed up as wisdom. There is always a reason it is not the year. The prices are uncertain, or the weather is uncertain, or the equipment is old, or the report needs more confirmation, or you should wait and see what your neighbors do first. Caution that has been elevated into a philosophy does not protect you from loss. It just makes the loss feel more respectable when it arrives. She ordered the mycorrhizal inoculant from a supplier in Ontario. She reduced the phosphorus on the south blocks. She applied the compost amendment to the trial acreage in April, when the ground was just workable. Sophie asked her once whether she was sure. Gisèle said she was sure about the soil biology and uncertain about everything else, which was the most honest answer she could give. Let me tell you about the spring co-op meeting in May 2008, because it is the part of this story that has a shape to it. The meeting was in the community hall in Alma, and there were 43 producers in the chairs and the co-op fieldman, a man named Pierre-Luc Gagnon, who had been in the job for 12 years and who carried himself with the specific authority of someone who has given the same correct advice long enough that he has stopped checking whether it is still correct. He was not a bad man. He was a man who had built his professional identity around a set of recommendations that had been right for a long time, and who had not yet had a reason to examine what happened when the conditions those recommendations were built for began to shift. He was talking about the new provincial phosphorus guidelines when Gisèle raised her hand. She did not ask a question exactly. She described, briefly, what she had found in her soil samples. She described the mycorrhizal suppression numbers. She said she had reduced her phosphorus on the south blocks and was trialing a biological amendment program, and that she had data from Laval suggesting the standard input rates were compromising the fungal communities that low-bush varieties depended on. Pierre-Luc Gagnon looked at her over the top of the table. He had the expression of a man who is choosing, in real time, between taking something seriously and dismissing it, and who has made this choice many times before and knows which one is easier. He said, Gisèle, the provincial guidelines are based on 20 years of trial data across the whole region. She said, I know, I've read them. He said, mycorrhizal products are not proven technology in commercial low-bush production. You're looking at a significant input cost for uncertain returns. She said, I have uncertain returns right now. The south blocks are down 12% over 3 years. He smiled, the way people smile when they are deciding to be patient rather than convinced. He said, one bad stretch doesn't rewrite the agronomy. He looked at the room, not unkindly, just broadly, the way you look at a room when you want it to understand that the conversation is over. I'd hate to see anyone invest in something that the research hasn't caught up to yet. Two producers near the front nodded. Someone in the back shifted in his chair. The meeting moved on. Gisèle wrote 2 words in her green notebook and underlined them once. Let me ask you something. Have you ever presented careful evidence to someone who had already decided what it meant? Not someone hostile, someone reasonable, someone who, in a different context, might have listened, but who, in that room, in front of that audience, with that amount of professional history invested in a different conclusion, simply could not afford to agree with you. Because there is a specific kind of loneliness in that experience that does not go away when you turn out to be right. The rightness does not undo the room. You carry both of them. She drove home on the highway with the window down, even though it was cold, and she was quiet at dinner that night, and Sophie did not ask her about it, which was one of the ways Sophie was smarter than Dennis, even though Dennis read more. The 2008 season was inconclusive. The South blocks showed a slight improvement in berry size and uniformity, modest enough that you could attribute it to weather variation if you wanted to. Her total yield was roughly flat. The compost trial acreage came in 6% above the field average, which she noted in her notebook with a date and a soil temperature reading and did not mention to anyone at the co-op. The 2009 season was clearer. South blocks came in at 847 kilograms per acre, up from 701 the year before her program change, an improvement of 21% on the same ground. The compost trial acres averaged 912 kilograms per acre, which was the highest per-acre figure she had recorded on that section in 16 years of records. Her input costs on the south blocks had dropped by roughly $30 per acre due to the reduced phosphorus, partially offset by the inoculant cost, for a net input saving of $11 per acre. The biology was stabilizing. She could see it not just in the numbers but in the soil itself, in the way it broke apart in her hand. In the root structure she pulled up and looked at in the field on her hands and knees in August when nobody was watching. She wrote all of it in the green notebook. She did not publish it. She did not present it. She showed it to Sophie one evening at the kitchen table, and Sophie looked at the numbers for a long time without saying anything. And then she said, "Does Dennis know?" "Dennis knows what he reads." "Let me tell you about the summer of 2010, because that is when the proof became undeniable to everyone who had been trying to avoid it." The wet rot that moved through Lac-Saint-Jean that summer was not the worst in recorded history for the region, but it was the worst in 25 years, and it arrived with the particular patience of diseases that wait for the right conditions. A cool, wet June followed by warm, humid July days that did not dry between rains. Monilinia blight, a fungal pathogen. The kind that operates in the spaces between the plant and the soil, the kind that is managed not primarily with fungicide, but with the biological resilience of the root zone, with the diversity and density of the microbial community that either buffers the plant against invasion or doesn't. The operations that had been applying high phosphorus rates for years had, without knowing it, been selecting for exactly the wrong conditions. Phosphorus suppresses mycorrhizal fungi. Mycorrhizal fungi, among their other functions, compete with and suppress certain fungal pathogens. Strip out the mycorrhizae and you do not just lose a nutrient pathway. You remove a biological defense system that the plant evolved to rely on and that no fungicide program fully replaces. The Belanger operation to the north lost 40% of its harvestable acres. 3 other operations in the Alma corridor reported losses between 25 and 35%. Pierre-Luc Gagnon's phone ran hot through July with calls from producers who had followed his recommendations precisely and were watching their fields go gray at the margins. He told them to apply the registered fungicide at the maximum label rate and hope the weather broke. The weather broke in mid-August. Gisèle's south blocks, the section she had been rebuilding for 2 years, showed 11% blight damage. The compost trial acres showed 8%. Her conventional high-phosphorus north blocks, which she had not yet converted, showed 29%. She walked all of it in the 3rd week of August with her notebook and a camera and took systematic photographs of the boundary lines between management zones, which were visible from the road as a gradient from gray-green to full green, following her property lines almost exactly. She harvested 791 kilograms per acre from the south blocks in a disaster year. The regional average was 5 or 34. The Belanger operation averaged $388. She sat at the kitchen table in September with her notebook and the farm's financial records and did the numbers without drama, the way she had done every year for 22 years. Then she called Sophie and asked her to come over on Sunday. Denna came too, which she had expected. She put the notebook on the table and walked them through it. The Laval report from 2006, the 3 years of yield data, the input cost comparison, the 2010 blight damage by management zone, with the photographs she did not editorialize. She did not say "I told you so" because she did not need to, and because it would have cost more than it was worth. Dennis was quiet for a longer time than usual. He looked at the photographs. He picked up the Laval report and looked at the numbers the way a man looks at something he is deciding whether to take seriously. And then he set it down and looked at the kitchen table for a moment and said, "You've been sitting on this for 4 years." She said, "I've been building it for 4 years." Dollars. Sophie, who had been quiet, looked at her husband and then looked at her mother and said, "She sent the samples to Laval before you even knew she was worried." Dollars. Denny said, "I'm not disputing the results." Dollars. Gisèle said, "Not." She looked at him without coldness because she genuinely did not feel it. "The program works. I'd like to convert the North blocks over the next 2 seasons." She looked at Sophie. "If you both want to be involved, I'll show you what I'm doing and why. But I'm doing it either way." Dollars. She said it the way you state a fact about the weather, not unkindly, just finely. Dollars. Denny nodded. He picked up his coffee cup and looked at the notebook and said quietly, "What do you need for the North conversion?" Dollars. Sophie looked at her mother. Something passed between them that did not need to be named. Dollars. Let me tell you about the morning Pierre-Luc Gagnon called her, because it is the part of this story that is hardest to describe accurately. Dollars. It was a Tuesday in November 2010, and Gisèle was in the equipment shed doing inventory when her phone rang with the Alma number she recognized. She answered it and let the silence sit for a half-second before she said hello. Dollars. Pierre-Luc Gagnon had been in the industry for 14 years and had spent most of those years being the person other people called for answers. He was not used to being on the other end of a phone call he had not initiated, dollars, and it showed in the careful way he chose his opening sentence, dollars, which was about the season generally, and the blight damage generally, and the fact that several of his producers were asking him questions he was not sure he had good answers to. Dollars. She let him get there at his own pace. Dollars. He said he had heard her South blocks had come through the summer better than most. He said he was aware she had been doing something different with her inputs for a couple of years. He said, and here his voice changed slightly, not apologetically exactly, but with the particular quality of someone who has been working up to something. He said that if she had anything written up he could share with producers who were asking, he would appreciate it. Dollars. She said, "Pierre-Luc, in 2008 you told the room that the research hadn't caught up yet." Dollars. A pause. I know what I said. Dollars. She said, "The research was already there. I had 23 pages of it." She said it without heat. It was not a wound she was reopening. It was just the truth of the thing, stated plainly, so that they were both standing on the same ground when the conversation continued. Dollars. He said, "I understand that now." Dollars. She said, "It's not complicated. The phosphorus is suppressing the biology the plants need. Reduce it, rebuild the mycorrhizal community, let the soil do what it was doing before we overcorrected it." She paused. "I'll put together 2 pages. Yield numbers, input costs, the Laval data in plain language. You can share it with whoever needs it." Dollars. She put it together that week. 2 pages, clear and specific, with her own numbers and the academic references in a short list at the bottom. She dropped it at the co-op office in Alma on a Friday morning and left it with the front desk without asking for a receipt. Dollars. Let me tell you about what followed, because this story does not end in 2010. Dollars. By 2013, 9 operations in the Lac-Saint-Jean region had moved to reduced phosphorus biological programs. The Université Laval Extension Service, which had been conducting its own follow-up research in part, inspired by the questions that began circulating after the 2010 blight season, published a bulletin in 2014 recommending a reassessment of input rates in high phosphorus soils across the region. Dollars. Pierre-Luc Gagnon was listed in the acknowledgments as having facilitated grower access for the study. Dollars. Gisèle did not apply for the acknowledgment. She did not go looking for credit. She read the bulletin at the kitchen table one morning with her coffee and found her own numbers in it, cited as field data from an unnamed commercial operation in Lac-Saint-Jean, and felt something she could not quite name, which was something like the satisfaction of a thing coming to rest. Dollars. Her daughter Sophie came into the partnership formally in 2012 and took over the field scouting on the North Blocks while Gisèle focused on the biological program development and the cover crop trials she had started on the field margins. Dennis, who had retrained somewhat quietly and without announcement on soil biology, started asking better questions at Sunday dinner. He still read widely, but he had added a new category, things he had been wrong about. The operation had grown to 240 acres by 2015, and the farm's average yield per acre had increased from 698 kilograms in 2007 to 891 kilograms in 2015. Same land, same family, same short Quebec summers, and the same rocky acidic soil that had been there long before anyone thought to farm it. Let me tell you about August 2019, because that is where this story earns its ending. Gisèle was 64 years old and had been managing this land for 34 years. Sophie ran the day-to-day operations, and Denny had started attending the grower meetings with her, sitting in the middle rows now instead of reading about them afterward. Gisèle's granddaughter, Elise, was 14 years old, Sophie and Danis's daughter, and she had been walking the fields with her grandmother since she was old enough to keep up and old enough to stay quiet and observe. Elise kept a notebook. She had started it at 11 after finding a box of her grandmother's old Laval soil reports in the back of the equipment shed. She had asked Gisèle what mycorrhizal colonization meant, and Gisèle had sat down on a hay bale and explained it to her for 40 minutes, and Elise had written it all down in a careful hand and asked 2 follow-up questions that had surprised her grandmother. In August of 2019, Elise came to the kitchen table with her notebook and a printed article from a regenerative agriculture journal and a proposal. She had been reading about biochar amendment in acidic blueberry soils. The literature, she said, suggested it could further improve mycorrhizal habitat while raising water retention in the dry years. She had identified a source in northern Ontario and run a rough cost-benefit comparison. She wanted to trial 10 acres in the spring. Gisèle looked at the notebook. She looked at the article. She looked at her granddaughter. She did not ask how old she was. She did not ask whether she had enough experience. She did not tell her to wait. She said, "Show me the numbers." Elise opened the notebook and started talking. And Gisèle listened, not with the strained attention of a person holding themselves back from correcting, but with the full and open attention of someone who has been waiting a long time to hear exactly this kind of question, from exactly this kind of person. Denny was at the end of the table with his coffee. He looked at Elise talking and then looked at Gisèle listening, and he was quiet in a way that meant something different from the quiet of 2008. Sophie, leaning in the doorway, caught her mother's eye for a moment. Neither of them said anything. They did not need to. Let me tell you one last thing, because it is the thing this story has been about all along. The South blocks on the Tremblay operation have never gone back to the provincial input rates. The green notebook from 2006 is still in the equipment shed, in a box with the Laval report and 14 years of subsequent soil tests and a photograph of the field taken from the road in August 2010, when the gradient between the treated and untreated zones was visible from a moving car. Gisèle still walks the fields every morning when she is on the property, and she still pulls roots up by hand in late summer and looks at the colonization on the root hairs, the way her mother taught her to look at things that do not announce themselves, slowly and close up and with patience. In 2023, the mycorrhizal colonization rates on the original South blocks measured 71% in the most recent Laval analysis. In 2006, they had measured 31. The neighboring operation to the north, under its third manager since the Belanger sold in 2011, still applies the provincial input rates. Its average yield runs roughly 12% below the regional leader benchmark, which is now, and has been for several years, the Tremblay operation. Pierre-Luc Gagnon retired in 2018. He came to a field day at the Tremblay farm in the summer before he retired, and he stood at the edge of the south blocks in the August heat while Gisèle talked through the biological program for a group of younger producers. He listened to all of it. He did not add anything, and nobody expected him to. He found her afterward near the equipment shed and shook her hand and said, "You were patient." He meant it as a compliment. She accepted it as one because she understood that it was the most he had to give and that it had cost him something to bring it. Gisèle Tremblay still manages the operation at 69. Sophie runs it with her. Elise is 20 now and finishing her agronomy degree at Laval, the same department that ran the soil analysis in 2006, which she finds quietly satisfying in a way she cannot entirely explain. The first field she ever proposed a trial for is now in its 5th biochar cycle. The soil in the south blocks, on the land her mother walked before her and her grandmother managed before that, is the deepest and most biologically active it has been since anyone started measuring. She reduced the inputs when everyone said to increase them. They called it risky. The blight came, the conventional fields went gray, her fields held. And the notebook was right all along. I think about Gisèle Tremblay standing in that community hall in Alma, presenting careful evidence to a room that had already made up its mind, and I think about how easy it would have been to fold. Not out of weakness, out of exhaustion. Because being right in private and being dismissed in public at the same time is a particular kind of weight that wears on you in ways that have nothing to do with the science. What stayed with me about her story is not the yield numbers, though they matter. It's that she kept measuring. Every spring, water level. Every August, root colonization. Every season, her own records against the field average. She did not need the room to agree with her to keep going. She needed her notebook to keep being honest. There's something in that I find genuinely instructive, not because it's heroic, but because it's so quiet. The integrity of the thing was in the daily practice of it, not in the moment anyone finally acknowledged it. I've seen what happens when people abandon that kind of honesty with themselves. They start reading the data the way they want it to read. They round the numbers toward the conclusion that's easier to defend at Sunday dinner. Gisèle didn't do that. She circled the bad seasons in blue ink the same way she circled the good ones. She let the South blocks tell her what was actually happening rather than what she needed them to be doing. That's a kind of moral discipline that doesn't get talked about enough in the context of farming, or in any context where someone is trying to do careful work inside a system that has decided it already knows the answer. The intelligence piece is the one that gets misread most often in stories like this. People want to call it intuition or instinct or the wisdom of a woman who grew up on the land, and those things are real. But Gisèle also sent samples to Laval. She read a 23-page report twice. She cross-referenced the main field studies against her own zone data. The knowing was not mystical. It was earned, and it was earned the slow way, by learning what questions to ask and then actually going and finding the answers. And then she held on through 4 years of inconclusive results and one room full of people nodding at Pierre-Luc Gagnon while she sat in the back row with her green notebook. That's the third thing, the part that looks like stubbornness from the outside but is something more considered than that. It's the decision to stay with something you have genuinely reasoned your way into, even when the social cost of staying is higher than the social cost of letting go. She stayed because the data held, not because of pride, because the soil kept confirming what the report had said, season after season, quietly, the way the truth tends to confirm itself when you're patient enough to keep looking. What I carry from Gisèle's story is this. The fields that held through the 2010 blight didn't hold because she was lucky. They held because of what she chose to do with what she knew, years before anyone else was ready to listen. The notebook was already right. She just had to stay in the field long enough for the soil to prove it.